Little girl begs the judge to let her live with her mother. But the rich father had already bought the verdict. Outside the courtroom, the judge bitterly regrets his decision when he sees what the father was doing to the girl. Sarah Cooper walked through the bustling hallway of Franklin Public School with a faint smile, clutching a stack of art textbooks to her chest. She had just finished teaching her fourth graders a lesson on blending watercolors, an exercise meant to help them explore emotion through art. Although the overhead fluorescent lights buzzed and the scuffed linoleum floors squeaked with every footstep, Sarah's mind drifted far from her modest surroundings. She remembered a time when she wore designer dresses to elite charity galas, mingling with Boston's high society. Now, she wore scuffed flats and rummaged for sale rack bargains. Life had changed dramatically, but what weighed on her heart most was not the loss of luxury. It was the anxious face of her 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, who was set to face a custody hearing in less than a week. Sophie was gentle and artistic, sensitive to loud noises and prone to panic attacks in chaotic environments. For years, Sarah had helped her cope with anxiety by turning feelings into colors and shapes on paper. Yet, the looming courtroom date threatened everything. Her ex-husband, James Mitchell, a powerful third-generation real estate developer, had called upon every connection he possessed in Boston to tip the scales in his favor. Sarah knew the upcoming hearing would be an uphill battle. Sarah's journey into James Mitchell's world had been nothing short of a fairy tale. At first, raised in a modest suburban household, she grew up drawing murals on the sidewalk and teaching herself new painting techniques from library books. She eventually became an art teacher, passionate about introducing children to the healing power of creativity. One particular year, she was invited to volunteer at a prestigious charity gala held at a mansion on Beacon Hill. The event aimed to raise funds to provide art classes for underprivileged children, and Sarah was in charge of designing an interactive art station. That evening, the opulence of Boston's elite was on full display. Crystal chandeliers, roped-off red carpets, waiters circulating with silver trays of caviar canapes. Sarah, in her simple black dress, felt like an outsider among the socialites, their laughter echoing through the grand ballroom. And then she had locked eyes with James Mitchell. Tall and composed, with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance, James was instantly taken by her gentle smile and artistic flair. He introduced himself, praising her dedication to teaching disadvantaged youth. At the time, Sarah believed she saw genuine warmth in him, a softness behind his measured tone. What she couldn't have known was that James's philanthropic gestures often served more as strategic social capital than acts of empathy. His father, Gerald Mitchell, had carefully groomed James to maintain the family's pristine reputation and expand their political and financial clout. That night, though, James seemed enthralled by Sarah's ideals, drawn to her sincere passion for art and education. A brief conversation turned into dinner invitations, then weekends in the countryside. Before long, they were inseparable. Their courtship was a blur of extravagant dates, dinner at exclusive clubs, yacht parties on the North Shore, and spontaneous weekend getaways to Martha's Vineyard. Sarah initially relished these experiences, cherishing how James exposed her to a broader world. James, in turn, appeared to admire Sarah's unpretentious warmth. She wasn't like the socialites he often encountered. She valued creativity and compassion over status. Their relationship moved quickly, culminating in a grand wedding at a historic Boston church. It was the talk of the season, with guests from both working-class communities and the highest echelons of New England society sharing pews. In their first year of marriage, Sarah continued working as an elementary school art teacher. James seemed supportive. He funded the purchase of new classroom supplies at her school and even hosted a small exhibit of his wife's students' paintings in the lobby of one of his commercial buildings. Sarah believed it was a partnership that blended their two worlds, money meeting meaning, capital meeting creativity. Privately, James was more rigid and formal than Sarah had anticipated. He disliked clutter and demanded a systematic approach to daily life. Bills were paid through carefully structured accounts he insisted on managing, and he constantly reminded Sarah that punctuality was a form of respect. For a while, they compromised well enough. Sarah would tidy her painting supplies promptly after use, and James would occasionally indulge her by participating in weekend art projects. When Sarah became pregnant, James softened slightly. He would gingerly place a hand on her belly, murmuring that he hoped for a bright future for their child. Sophie's arrival was transformative. Born on a stormy January night, she came into the world with a delicate cry, as if testing her voice against the howling winds outside. From the start, Sarah felt an instant bond with her daughter, a fierce maternal love that overflowed each time she rocked Sophie to sleep. James, on the other hand, took on fatherhood with clinical precision. He read parenting manuals that emphasized developmental milestones and began plotting out Sophie's future even before she could babble. Preschool, private elementary, and eventually an Ivy League path, he had the entire script ready. Yet Sophie was no blueprint baby. By age 6, she exhibited signs of severe anxiety. Loud noises made her cry uncontrollably, and she struggled to socialize with kids who teased her or insisted on playing competitive games. Sarah's instincts told her that art therapy might help. She started dedicating evenings to paint-by-number kits, abstract watercolor splashes, and journaling through drawing. Gradually, Sophie found solace in blending colors that represented her moods. A swirl of blue for sadness, a burst of orange for excitement. Sarah watched her daughter's artistry blossom, but James dismissed these sessions as impractical. He insisted that Sophie needed to toughen up for the real world. Tensions flared. Sarah argued that Sophie needed emotional support, not discipline, especially given her panic attacks. James scorned any mention of therapy or counseling, claiming it would label their daughter as weak or, worse, damage her prospects for a prestigious future. He believed in measured drills, piano lessons, language tutoring, etiquette classes, anything that would mold Sophie into the shining daughter of the Mitchell lineage. By the time Sophie was 7, Sarah and James's arguments had become a nightly ritual. The final straw came when Sophie suffered an intense panic attack during a dinner with James's business associates. In front of a table of colleagues, Sophie began hyperventilating, eyes brimming with tears, as she clutched Sarah's hand desperately. James's mortified reaction was to berate Sarah in private for not preparing Sophie to handle social gatherings. He even threatened to restrict Sophie from any more art-based coddling and demanded that Sarah focus on discipline. Unable to bear the constant tension and dismissive attitude toward Sophie's well-being, Sarah filed for divorce. That was when James revealed a different side, a strategic, ruthless side. Under the guise of protecting his finances during litigation, he convinced Sarah to resign from her teaching job. He cited legal complexities, pointing out that her employment might interfere with Sophie's schedule. Naively, Sarah agreed. Once she left her position, James funneled household funds into accounts she couldn't access, leaving her financially stranded. Worse, Sarah found herself blacklisted from the top private schools in the area, no doubt due to James's network of well-placed friends. Reputation damage soon followed, as rumors circulated that Sarah was unstable and prone to emotional outbursts. Forced to piece her life back together, Sarah accepted a position at Franklin Public School. Understaffed, underfunded, but desperate for a passionate teacher. Despite the pay cut, Sarah thrived on the chance to help children who reminded her of Sophie, kids with potential weighed down by adversity. Throughout the bitter separation, Sophie's anxiety soared. She frequently clung to Sarah, sobbing whenever court paperwork arrived in the mail. Art therapy continued at home, with Sophie often drawing abstract figures in swirling patterns of red and gray. These paintings spoke of her turmoil. Meanwhile, James's demands escalated. He insisted on having Sophie over for weekends, where she was expected to practice piano and study French vocabulary lists for hours. Each time Sarah picked Sophie up afterward, the girl seemed more drained, as though the color had been leached from her spirit. The custody battle was fast approaching. James leveraged his wealth and status, assembling a formidable legal team. Sarah had no choice but to seek pro bono representation. Enter Linda Martinez, a tenacious attorney with a heart for social justice. She believed in Sarah's case, firmly convinced that a mother's nurturing was crucial for a child, especially one dealing with severe anxiety. Nevertheless, Linda knew the system was notoriously skewed toward whoever had deeper pockets, especially in a city like Boston, where old money mingled with the judicial ranks. In the months leading up to the trial, James made strategic moves to isolate Sarah further. He fed the media stories portraying Sarah as a struggling ex-wife who couldn't provide a stable environment. He hosted lavish fundraisers attended by local politicians and judges, consolidating his influence. Few dared to challenge a Mitchell in court. Quiet rumors spread that James had made significant donations to the re-election campaign of Judge Michael Harrison, a respected figure with a decades-long record of integrity. Sarah thought this was out of character for Harrison, who was known for championing honest hearings. She had met him briefly years ago at an education forum. He seemed the kind of man who valued fairness above all else. But something felt off. Sarah barely slept in the nights before the hearing, haunted by nightmares of losing Sophie to James's cold, perfectionist household. She couldn't fathom her daughter's gentle spirit thriving there. On the final Sunday before the trial, mother and daughter painted a sunset together, blending watercolors in silent harmony. Sophie's little hand was steady, her expression calm for the first time in weeks. When the piece was complete, Sophie gently pressed it into Sarah's hands. "It's our happy place, Mom," she whispered. "Promise I can come back and paint it again." Sarah had tears in her eyes. She held Sophie tight and whispered, "I promise I'll do everything I can." Little did either of them know how high the stakes truly were. The morning of the custody hearing arrived. Sarah stood outside the courthouse, Linda Martinez beside her. The grand stone pillars loomed overhead, casting a long shadow. Sarah was trembling, but a fierce resolve burned in her chest. She glanced at Sophie, pale and wide-eyed, her tiny fingers wrapped around Sarah's. James approached, flanked by his imposing lawyers. He wore a crisp navy suit and a thin smile that barely concealed his confidence. Inside, the corridors buzzed with hushed conversations. Sarah could see the door leading to Judge Harrison's courtroom at the end of the hall. She inhaled sharply. Everything, her maternal love, her life's meaning, hung in the balance. In that charged moment, Judge Michael Harrison emerged from his chambers. He paused, locking eyes with Sarah. She saw a flicker of guilt or conflict etched in his lined face. Was there still a shred of fairness left in the system? Or would James's power override all sense of justice? Sarah clenched Sophie's hand. Linda leaned in to whisper, "Ready?" Sarah exhaled. "I have to be," she said, stepping forward. They pushed open the heavy doors, bracing themselves for the battle to come. The tension in Judge Harrison's courtroom was palpable, like the charged atmosphere right before a summer thunderstorm. Rows of polished pews gleamed under fluorescent lights, and the towering mahogany bench gave the judge a commanding vantage point. Sarah swallowed hard as she took her seat next to Linda, facing the long, wooden tables that separated them from James and his legal team. James's lawyers laid out thick binders, brimming with documents and expert analyses. Linda's resources were far more modest. A thin folder of evidence and a few photographs showing Sophie's joyful engagement in art therapy sessions with Sarah. A bailiff signaled everyone to rise. Judge Harrison entered, his black robe swishing around his ankles. His face remained impassive, a mask of judicial neutrality that Sarah struggled to read. Only the subtlest tremor in his brow hinted at inner conflict. He cleared his throat before beckoning both parties to begin. James's lead counsel, a silver-haired attorney named Howard Brantley, strutted to the podium. In measured tones, he detailed James's impeccable background. A third-generation real estate developer, a pillar of the Boston philanthropic scene, and a devoted father. Brantley introduced a series of paid experts who testified about the value of structure in a child's upbringing. One child psychologist, a man with thick-rimmed glasses, cited studies that emphasized the benefits of rigor in academic and extracurricular scheduling. A private investigator presented photographs of Sarah's modest apartment, scrutinizing everything from mismatched furniture to a water stain on the ceiling, painting a picture of instability. When James himself took the stand, he spoke with unwavering composure. "My daughter Sophie deserves the best education and environment," he said, glancing at the judge. I only want to ensure she reaches her full potential. I am prepared to offer her financial security and access to every resource. With all due respect, I'm concerned that Ms. Cooper is too emotionally fragile and financially unprepared to meet Sophie's needs. Sarah bristled at his words. Emotionally fragile? It was an ironic accusation coming from the man who had systematically chipped away at her independence. But she remained silent for now. Linda squeezed Sarah's hand beneath the table, a silent vow that they would have their turn. Linda rose, heels clicking on the polished floor. She was petite, but her voice carried the conviction of someone who had spent years championing underdogs. She introduced Sarah's perspective, a dedicated teacher who nurtured Sophie's emotional well-being through art therapy. Linda spoke of how Sophie's anxiety had improved under Sarah's attentive care. At Linda's cue, Sarah took the stand, recounting in soft, tremulous tones the nights Sophie spent awake, trembling from nightmares only to calm down when painting. Your Honor, Sarah concluded, tears pooling in her eyes, I understand that James can provide a big house and private tutors. But Sophie's anxiety is delicate. She needs a supportive environment, not a strict regimen that dismisses her fears. I want nothing more than for her to have both love and resources. But if forced to choose, love will always come first. Next came Sophie's testimony, a moment that made Sarah's heart pound. The bailiff led the 8-year-old to the stand. Sophie's small frame seemed dwarfed by the large wooden chair, and her trembling voice wavered in the hushed courtroom. She explained how drawing helped her talk about feelings she couldn't express in words. She spoke of the panic attacks that overtook her when pressured too intensely, and how her mother's gentle presence brought calm. Judge Harrison's gaze softened slightly, particularly when Sophie explained that playing the piano for 3 hours every Saturday at her father's house made her chest feel tight and her lungs burn. In that moment, Sarah saw compassion flicker across Harrison's face. But then his features hardened once more, an internal battle lurking just beneath the surface. Unbeknownst to Sarah, Judge Harrison was waging a private war inside. His wife, Carol, was battling advanced breast cancer, and the cost of her treatments had ballooned beyond anything their insurance could cover. The Mitchell family, through a network of charitable funds and well-timed donations, had discreetly offered to support Carol's medical journey. It was not a direct bribe in an envelope, but the correlation was impossible for Harrison to ignore. His wife's life hinged on expensive medication. The Mitchells had found the perfect vulnerability. As Sophie finished her emotional testimony, Judge Harrison felt a knot tighten in his gut. He saw shadows of his own daughter, long grown and moved away, in Sophie's trembling expression. He recalled how his little girl used to suffer from night terrors, and how he and Carol would sit by her bed, telling her stories of enchanted forests and gentle fairies until she drifted back to sleep. A wave of regret washed over him. But he had allowed the Mitchell money to seep into his life, or rather, his wife's life-saving treatments. And a part of him knew that any ruling against James might jeopardize that desperately needed funding. After the final arguments and a tense recess, the court reconvened. Sarah's pulse hammered in her throat. She clutched Linda's hand, silently praying for a miracle. Sophie sat beside her, arms wrapped around her mother's waist. On the other side, James straightened his suit jacket, exuding unbreakable confidence. Judge Harrison delivered his ruling with a voice that sounded almost detached. He acknowledged that Sophie had emotional needs, but stated that James could provide a structured environment proven to benefit children's growth. Despite Sophie's plea to remain with her mother, Harrison's final words echoed like a funeral bell. Custody of the minor child, Sophie Mitchell, is hereby awarded to Mr. James Mitchell. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Sarah felt the world crash around her. She squeezed Sophie so tightly that the bailiff had to intervene. Sophie's cries reverberated through the silent chamber. Even Linda Martinez seemed momentarily speechless. James's lips curved into a tight, triumphant line. A hush settled as Harrison looked down from the bench. Was that remorse in his eyes? Sarah thought she caught a fleeting moment of anguish. But it did nothing to dull the pain of losing Sophie. Nothing to erase the image of James's lawyers smiling, exchanging firm handshakes as though they had just sealed another profitable deal. Court adjourned. The press waited outside, camera flashes strobing through the marble corridors. James's legal team quickly ushered him and Sophie away, while Sarah stood frozen in disbelief. Linda gently placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her to a quiet corner. "We can appeal," Linda whispered, though her voice lacked its usual spirited defiance. "We can gather more evidence." But Sarah barely heard her. Every thought focused on Sophie. She desperately scanned the corridor, catching sight of Sophie's tear-streaked face as James's lawyer led her toward a side exit. Sophie reached out with trembling fingers, calling for her mother. "Sophie!" Sarah cried, darting forward. A security guard blocked her path. James gripped Sophie's hand, pulling her along. "Don't make a scene," he said sternly to his daughter, though his eyes flickered with a mixture of victory and impatience. Behind them trailed Judge Harrison, looking burdened and haunted. Sarah locked eyes with him once more, silently pleading. He turned away, shoulders sagging under a weight she did not yet comprehend. As the crowd thinned, Sarah and Linda made their way to the corridor where Sophie had disappeared. A wave of heartbreak seized Sarah the moment she heard Sophie's muffled sobs echoing off the marble walls. The corridor led to a restricted exit. Sarah had no pass, no authority to go beyond. She slumped against the wall, tears streaming down her cheeks. Linda tried to console her, but words felt hollow. "I'm so sorry," the lawyer whispered. "This isn't over." Around the corner, Judge Harrison paused. He could hear Sophie's soft cries, hear Sarah's desperate pleas. He wanted to step forward, to say something. Anything that might mend what his verdict had shattered. But the memory of Carol's hospital bed and the Mitchell-sponsored checks for medical bills played over in his mind. Silently, he clenched his fists and walked away. While Sarah crumpled under the weight of her loss, James's team was already tying up loose ends. Money had exchanged hands through a series of charitable donations and shell organizations. Everything appeared legal on the surface, shielded by layered transactions. Judge Harrison's conscience simmered, but his outward composure never faltered. For Sarah, the heartbreak was immediate and raw. For Harrison, it was a slow bleed of guilt, each step toward his private chambers feeling like a descent into moral darkness. By the time he locked the door behind him, he could barely breathe. He slid into his leather chair and slumped forward, pressing his forehead against the cold surface of his desk. He whispered to the empty room, "What have I done?" Late that evening, Sarah was forced to gather Sophie's clothes and belongings to deliver them to James's estate. A courtesy phone call came from his lawyer. Sophie would be living at James's primary residence immediately. Sarah had never felt so helpless. Meanwhile, Linda meticulously reviewed her notes, scanning for any hint of judicial impropriety or conflict of interest. Though she suspected foul play, she had no proof. She resolved to keep digging, reaching out to connections who might shed light on Harrison's sudden tilt. Sophie, taken to her father's sprawling house, cried until her eyes stung. When James tried to comfort her with the promise of a new pony riding lesson, she only sobbed harder. Eventually, he grew cold, ordering her to stop crying if she wanted dinner. Sophie went silent, hugging her stuffed rabbit, a gift from her mother, unable to suppress the tidal wave of sorrow. 2 days after the hearing, Sarah was frantically scrolling through her phone, searching for any glimmer of hope. A text from Sophie, a missed call, anything. Her heart leapt when the screen lit up with an unknown number. She answered, praying it might be her daughter. Instead, a tremulous voice introduced herself as Miss Chan, Sophie's new art teacher. Though the class was an after-school program, Sophie was attending in secret. "Miss Cooper," Miss Chan said, her voice laden with concern. "I found your number from an old-school contact form. Something's not right with Sophie. She barely speaks. Today, she wouldn't even pick up a paintbrush, and she always loved to paint. She seems terrified. I thought you'd want to know." Sarah's chest constricted. "Thank you," she whispered, tears threatening to choke her. She had no official custody, no legal power to intervene. But she had to protect her daughter. She ended the call, trembling with desperation. Before she could gather her thoughts, another message flashed. Linda had left her a voicemail. Her tone was urgent, borderline frantic. "Sarah, I've learned something about Judge Harrison. I need to see you. Right away." Sarah hung up and stared at the phone. Her heart pounded in her ears. Ms. Chen's revelation about Sophie, plus Linda's cryptic message, hit her like thunderbolts. Alone in her small apartment, Sarah realized the fight was only just beginning. Somewhere across town, James Mitchell was tightening his grip on Sophie's life, while a conflicted Judge Harrison sat on a secret that could uproot everything. Unanswered questions echoed through Sarah's mind. Could she rescue Sophie from the emotional stranglehold of a father obsessed with control? Could Linda expose corruption in a system so heavily tilted by power and money? And what price would Judge Harrison pay if he dared to tell the truth? Outside, the night sky rumbled with the promise of a coming storm. Sarah braced herself for the tempest looming ahead. Sarah ended the phone call with Ms. Chun feeling an urgent wave of panic course through her body. She set her phone down on her small kitchen table, its surface cluttered with half-finished lesson plans and old bank statements. Outside, a cold wind rattled the window pane, and the faint glow of a street lamp cast trembling shadows across the walls. Her daughter was suffering in silence, stripped of the one outlet that had always offered her comfort. Sophie was barely speaking at school and, worst of all, avoiding the paintbrush like it was a source of punishment rather than relief. Sarah fought back tears as she grabbed her coat and headed to meet Linda Martinez, who had left an urgent message with more questions than answers. Despite the late hour, Linda's office lights still blazed. When Sarah arrived, she found the lawyer hunched over a desk piled with open manila folders. A single fluorescent lamp buzzed overhead. Linda looked up, eyes bloodshot from hours of research. She motioned Sarah over. The moment Sarah sank into the chair beside her, Linda slid a stack of photocopied documents across the desk. They showed a maze of financial transfers, charitable trusts, and medical-related donations. Sarah's eyes flickered over lines of corporate legalese and the repeated appearance of one name, Mitchell. Linda leaned in and whispered, "I've been trying to piece this together ever since we lost in court. These records aren't definitive proof, but they strongly suggest that James has been funneling money into something that links back to Judge Harrison's household expenses." Sarah's pulse quickened as she recognized a hospital's name in the documents. She recalled overhearing courthouse gossip that Carol Harrison had been ill. "Are you saying James paid for the judge's wife's treatment?" she asked, barely able to contain her shock. "Indirectly, yes," Linda said. "A web of donations that are suspiciously timed right before and right after our hearing. Nothing explicitly illegal on the surface, but it's too much to be a coincidence." I also discovered that a so-called charity board Harrison once chaired was reactivated around the time Carol's cancer got worse. Then a trust associated with James's real estate conglomerate made a sizable contribution. Sarah's initial horror flared into a quiet, determined anger. "What can we do with this?" Linda closed the folder. "We don't have enough yet to definitively accuse a sitting judge of corruption. But it's a thread, and if we keep pulling, maybe the whole thing unravels." A heavy silence filled the room as they considered the ramifications. Confronting a well-connected developer and a respected judge sounded like an act of sheer futility. Yet, Sarah thought of Sophie and how her daughter's voice seemed to be slipping away. She refused to let fear paralyze her any longer. Rising from the chair, she told Linda, "I'll do whatever it takes. I just need to see Sophie safe." Linda offered a resolute nod. "Then we start by talking to anyone who's witnessed how James treats Sophie. We need credible witnesses and more concrete evidence." They parted ways in the empty parking lot, each bracing against the biting wind. Sarah drove home, her mind a churn of anxious plans. She wondered if Miss Chun could help. Perhaps the art teacher had seen something more specific than just Sophie's silence. Maybe she had overheard James's instructions to staff or witnessed direct emotional abuse. Sarah clung to the hope of turning Miss Chen's observations into a lifeline. Early the next morning, Sarah arrived at the community center where Miss Chun taught after-school art classes. It was a modest brick building with a single large room partitioned into art stations. Children's paintings of rainbows, family portraits, and swirling abstract shapes covered the walls, brightening the dingy space. Miss Chun greeted Sarah with a warm but worried smile. She spoke quietly, mindful of the handful of kids scattered around, busy with colored pencils and glue sticks. Sophie used to arrive so enthusiastic, Miss Chen explained, leading Sarah to a far corner where she stored completed artwork. She'd practically run to the paint station. But recently she's refused to even look at the brushes. Sarah noticed a small drawing pinned to the corkboard. It featured a lone figure in black, standing under a gray sky. The child who had drawn it had scrawled the word, "Why?" in a corner, the letters crooked and uncertain. Sarah felt a shiver, imagining that might be the question swirling in Sophie's mind every day. "When was the last time you saw her?" she asked, voice trembling with concern. Miss Chun hesitated before answering. "Last week, she came in with her father. He was livid she was here at all. He yanked her away midway through class, telling her that this kind of thing was a waste of time and that her mother was just filling her head with nonsense." The look on Sophie's face, Miss Chun shook her head as her voice caught. She looked terrified. Sarah swallowed a thick knot of rage and sorrow. "Thank you," she whispered. "This could help us. If you're willing to make a statement." "Absolutely," Miss Chun said, eyes flickering with conviction. "I'll do anything to help Sophie." They exchanged contact details, and Miss Chun promised to cooperate with Linda if it came to building a stronger case. Before leaving, Sarah took a moment to gaze at the display of children's art. It hurt deeply to imagine Sophie forbidden from expressing herself, especially when that very act had once been her escape from the anxieties of the world. Later that day, Sarah found herself at Boston Common, the historic park lined with old elm trees. She had chosen the common to clear her head and recall memories of simpler times when she used to stroll with Sophie, feeding ducks on the pond. The crisp afternoon air felt like a balm against her overheated thoughts. She walked slowly, occasionally stopping to watch families playing catch or couples picnicking. Her phone rang, jarring her from reverie. It was Linda again. "I've just contacted Ms. Chun," Linda said. "She's agreed to speak on record. Good news, but we'll need more. If James is truly controlling every moment of Sophie's life, it's likely other people in his household have witnessed it. We should see if we can track down any nannies or tutors." Sarah's heart tightened. "He fires them quickly if they let Sophie paint or doodle. It might be hard to locate them, but I'll try." They ended the call, and Sarah realized she was standing by the statue of a duck family, a whimsical sculpture that had always made Sophie smile. That small recollection almost brought her to tears. She turned, intending to head back to her car when she heard a soft whimper. Across the lawn, partially hidden behind a large maple tree, stood James in a dark overcoat, gripping Sophie's wrist. The little girl's posture was rigid with fear, and she looked at the ground as though hoping it would swallow her. Sarah froze, uncertain whether to approach. Anger flared within her at the sight of James, but her maternal instinct urged her forward. She moved cautiously, staying behind a group of tourists so James wouldn't spot her immediately. She watched him scold Sophie in a harsh undertone. Although she couldn't hear every word, she caught snatches of his tirade. "Stop embarrassing me," and "I don't ever want you attending that class again." Sophie's shoulders shook with silent sobs. A scalding wave of helplessness surged through Sarah. She advanced a few more steps, her eyes burning. That was when she noticed a figure on a nearby bench watching them just as intently. Judge Michael Harrison, wearing a long coat, eyes fixed on James and Sophie with a haunted expression that mirrored Sarah's own despair. The judge's gaze flickered to Sarah, and for a moment, they locked eyes. She expected him to look away in guilt, but something in his face signaled a deeper torment. For a split second, she wondered if he might intervene. Instead, he tore his gaze from hers, rose abruptly, and hurried toward the pond, leaving behind the echoes of James's berating voice. The moment slipped away before Sarah could decide whether to confront James or chase after Harrison. By the time she reached that spot, James was marching Sophie toward the parking lot, his steps rigid. Sophie's tear-stained face vanished into the crowd. Sarah was left trembling, staring at the judge's retreating figure in the distance. the swirl of conflicting emotions, fury at James, yearning to comfort Sophie, curiosity about Harrison's silent anguish, stunned her into immobility. She dialed Linda again, voice shaking, and relayed what she had just witnessed. Linda was alarmed. Harrison saw this? That might be the catalyst we need. If he's any shred of the man people say he used to be, maybe he'll come forward. 2 days later, Judge Harrison appeared unannounced at Linda's modest law office. It was early evening, and the only sound was the rustle of papers as Linda scrambled to hide her shock. Sarah, who happened to be in the back room searching for old transcripts, felt her heart pound when Linda hastily beckoned her to the front. Harrison stood there, shoulders slumped, hat in hand like he had stepped out of an entirely different era. His hair looked disheveled, and the lines on his face revealed sleepless nights. "I need to speak with Miss Cooper," he began, voice so quiet they had to strain to hear. "And with you, Ms. Martinez." Suspicion flared in Linda's eyes. She gestured for him to sit, but he declined, remaining stiffly upright. Sarah joined them in the small reception area, her arms folded protectively across her chest. Harrison took a measured breath. "I can't reverse the official ruling, and I cannot remain your presiding judge, but I may have information that can help you in a new hearing. I've made decisions I'm not proud of. What I saw at Boston Common confirmed things I was trying to rationalize away." Linda pressed him. "Then tell us everything. If James used financial leverage against you, or if there's any evidence that Sophie is in danger, we need it." He hesitated, the flicker of shame in his eyes growing more pronounced. Slowly, he explained how mounting medical bills for Carol's cancer had left him desperate. He admitted that Mitchell's various trusts and philanthropic funds had conveniently arrived at the right time. It wasn't a direct bribe, but it was enough to sway him. Sarah swallowed the bitter taste of validation. The heartbreak of losing Sophie had always hinted at corruption, but hearing it confirmed felt like salt on an open wound. Harrison's voice trembled. "I saw James gripping Sophie's arm that day in the park, and I realized how I'd failed that child. Carol's treatments are ongoing, but I can't ignore what I've done. I need to make this right, even if it costs me everything." A swirl of emotions crossed Linda's face. Anger, relief, maybe even pity. Sarah, for her part, fought back tears as she envisioned Sophie's frightened eyes. She finally said, "If you truly want to help, we need documentation. We need to show that James isn't just strict, he's emotionally abusive. And we need proof you were compromised." Harrison nodded solemnly. "I've started gathering records. Transactions, emails, memos. I've also spoken to a teacher of Sophie's who reached out. Miss Chun, is it? She told me about Sophie's worrying behavior at school. And I've learned that James fired 3 nannies in a row for letting Sophie engage in painting. He even installed surveillance cameras in her bedroom to ensure she doesn't draw." Linda's eyes widened. "That's exactly the kind of pattern we can use in court. But we must be careful. If James' suspects were assembling a case, he'll bury the evidence or intimidate witnesses. He has the means to do it." Harrison's gaze flickered with genuine remorse. "I'll do whatever it takes. I don't expect forgiveness, but I won't rest until that child is out of his grip." Sarah allowed herself a tentative shred of hope. A strange alliance had formed. A disgraced judge, a mother desperate to save her daughter, a tenacious lawyer, and an empathetic art teacher. The stakes rose with every passing day. They couldn't let James suspect they were planning a renewed custody hearing. For her part, Sarah took a leave of absence from work to focus entirely on gathering statements, medical reports, and anything else Linda requested. Ms. Chun dug into contact lists for any families or staff who'd left James's employ. Linda arranged to speak with them quietly, vetting each story for consistency. Harrison, however, found that the hardest part of his newfound determination was facing Carol. One late night, he came home to find her awake in the living room, the soft light of a table lamp illuminating her pale features. The progression of her illness had left her thinner, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. She held a small sheaf of papers, transaction receipts linking the philanthropic fund to her hospital bills. He froze, heart pounding, as she met his gaze. "Michael," she said softly, "I've known something was wrong for weeks now. You come home at odd hours, you barely sleep, and I've seen your conscience tearing you apart. Are these the reason?" He sank into the chair opposite her. "I never wanted you to worry," he began, voice cracking under the weight of his guilt. "I made a terrible mistake. I put my integrity up for sale. I did it for you, but that doesn't make it right." Tears glistened in Carol's eyes, though her voice steadied. "I won't accept that. If my health meant you losing your morality, I would rather forego the treatment. Michael, you have to fix this. We can't take that man's money at the cost of a child's future." He reached for her hand, and she squeezed his fingers gently, as though giving him permission to do the difficult thing. Her words fueled him. That very night, he locked himself in his study and continued compiling every piece of incriminating evidence he could find. He emailed Linda scanned documents of bank statements and donation records, every detail meticulously annotated. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became that James had manipulated more than just this single custody case. There were discrepancies in property settlement rulings, suspiciously short sentencing in real estate fraud lawsuits, and a pattern of quiet influence that had netted Mitchell an almost impenetrable shield within Boston's legal community. A week passed. Sarah's phone buzzed continuously with updates, each tiny revelation forming another piece of the puzzle. Miss Chun managed to locate one of Sophie's former nannies, a kind woman named Harriet, who revealed that James had ordered her never to let Sophie use crayons or paint. When Harriet allowed Sophie to color in a simple children's book, James erupted in rage and fired her that very night. Harriet testified that she had seen him yell at Sophie for being weak or acting like her mother. Linda took careful notes, grateful for the nanny's willingness to be interviewed on record. As the days wore on, Sarah felt a renewed sense of urgency. She had not seen Sophie in nearly 2 weeks, apart from rare glimpses during scheduled phone calls that James often cut short. When she asked Sophie how she was, her daughter responded in monotone, offering single-syllable answers. The sparkle and musical lilt once evident in her voice seemed to have vanished. At night, Sarah would lie awake recalling her daughter's colorful drawings taped around their old apartment and wonder if Sophie remembered the promise they had made to paint that bright sunset again. Linda finally decided they had enough to file for an emergency hearing. The usual process would take months, but with Judge Harrison's mounting evidence and willingness to come forward, they hoped to expedite a review. The strategy was perilous. If James got wind of their plan too soon, he might intimidate or buy off witnesses. Their only chance lay in catching him off guard. The day before Linda intended to file the motion, Sarah received an unexpected text from Sophie. It read, "Mom, I need help. Nothing more, no details, no signature." Sarah's heart plummeted. She tried calling Sophie's phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. In desperation, she even tried James, who refused to answer. The next morning, Linda marched into the courthouse with Harrison's documents in a sealed envelope, Harriet's affidavit in hand, Ms. Chen's statement, and an official request for an emergency custody reevaluation. The wheels were set in motion. Sarah was at home, numb with worry, when her phone rang. The number was blocked. She answered, half expecting it to be Sophie again. Instead, James's crisp, measured tones stabbed through the line. "So you think you can pull a stunt like this and ruin me?" he said, quiet fury barely masked. "I can bury you, Sarah, and that sanctimonious judge, too. Drop it now, or I promise you'll never see your daughter again." Sarah clutched her phone, tears springing to her eyes, but she refused to be cowed. "You can threaten me all you want," she whispered, voice shaking, "but I'm not going to let you destroy Sophie's life." He gave a disdainful snort. "You want war? Fine. Enjoy losing again." The call ended abruptly. Sarah's hand shook so violently that she nearly dropped the phone. She called Linda, who assured her that the hearing date was set for 3 days later. They had precious little time to brace themselves for James's counterattack. Harrison prepared to go on record about the bribes, fully aware it could end his judicial career. Ms. Chun promised to appear, Harriet likewise. They all knew James would come armed with an army of high-priced lawyers and plausible deniability. On the eve of the emergency hearing, Sarah received a cryptic note from a courier service. It contained a small diary with a pink cover, the edges worn as if clutched by tiny hands. The front page bore Sophie's name in curly letters. Sarah's throat constricted when she realized it must have been smuggled out by someone in James's household. Perhaps a staff member who sympathized. Hands trembling, she turned the pages. Instead of neat sentences, she found drawings. Pages upon pages of stick figures in harsh black lines. One figure towered over a smaller one, arms raised like an angry giant. The smaller figure was often sketched with tears or a mouth shaped in a silent scream. In one haunting image, the larger figure ripped a paintbrush from the smaller figure's hand and snapped it in two. Short phrases occasionally punctuated the images. "I can't talk. Don't cry. I'm afraid." Sarah wept as she realized Sophie had documented her suffering in the only language she had left. Pictures. She called Linda, who advised her to keep the diary safe and submit it as evidence at the hearing. "This could be our smoking gun," Linda said. "Visual proof of emotional abuse that can't be dismissed as hearsay. Let's pray the new judge sees it for what it is." In a downtown Boston skyscraper, James also prepared for battle. He confronted Harrison in a private phone call, warning him that if he dared to testify, James would expose the entire fiasco, claiming Harrison sought bribes from him. Harrison hung up without a word and placed the phone on his desk, a swirl of dread and determination twisting in his gut. He refused to let intimidation dictate his next move. A single lamp illuminated his cluttered desk, and in its glow, the confession letter he had drafted lay waiting, naming names, detailing every compromised ruling, and condemning the circumstances that had led him to betray his judicial oath. At dawn, Sarah prayed for strength while sipping cold coffee. She felt like a soldier on the brink of a final assault. In just a few hours, they would stand before a new judge and present a case that would either free Sophie or seal her fate indefinitely. That knowledge weighed so heavily on Sarah's spirit that every breath felt like an effort. She forced herself to remember Sophie's brightest smile and how, once upon a time, painting made her child feel safe. That was her only clarity in the chaos. She had to restore Sophie's chance at happiness, no matter the cost. When Sarah arrived at the courthouse, a group had already gathered. Linda, Miss Chen, Harriet, and even the newly contrite Harrison. Together, they were an unlikely alliance, bound by guilt, love, empathy, and a craving for justice. Wordlessly, they filed through the doors and into the fluorescent-lit corridors, heading for the hearing room that would decide Sophie's fate. Sarah glanced at Linda, and the lawyer gave a small, confident nod. They were as prepared as they could be. James stood near the entrance in a sleek suit, his lawyers whispering last-minute instructions. He cast Sarah a look of disdain. She noticed Sophie clinging to his side, eyes downcast, silent. Her cheeks looked pale, and her shoulders drooped. Sarah fought every impulse to run and gather her daughter into her arms. She tried to catch Sophie's gaze, but Sophie stared at the floor, as though too frightened to even acknowledge her mother's presence. They took their seats in the courtroom, tension coiling in the air so thick it felt suffocating. The new judge, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and calm eyes, entered. An official called the session to order, and the swirl of the final battle began. Sarah prayed silently for courage. Outside, the sky hung gray, heavy with impending rain, mirroring the dread in Sarah's heart. She told herself that no matter how stormy it became, she would protect Sophie. The time had come to bring every secret into the light, no matter how explosive the truth would be. 3 hours later, the hearing erupted in chaos, as though the tension that had been simmering all this time finally broke loose. James's legal team came out swinging, challenging each witness's credibility. Harriet was the first to testify, describing the incident when James fired her for letting Sophie color in a children's book. She recalled his harsh words, how he demanded Harriet eradicate those silly habits or face immediate dismissal. The cross-examination tried to discredit her by pointing out small inconsistencies in her memory of dates. But Harriet held her ground, tearfully insisting she had witnessed emotional abuse. Ms. Chun spoke next, detailing how Sophie's once expressive nature had withered under James's prohibitions. She recounted seeing him yank Sophie out of class and scold her for wasting time. The defense tried to cast Ms. Chun as a biased teacher loyal to Sarah, but Ms. Chen's gentle honesty shone through. She insisted she had no personal motive beyond the welfare of her student. Sarah felt a flicker of hope as each testimony chipped away at James's immaculate facade. Yet the real shockwaves came when Judge Harrison took the stand. There was an audible hush in the courtroom as he explained his own role, his voice faltering under the weight of his confession. He described how financial pressures tied to his wife's cancer treatments had led him to rationalize the acceptance of Mitchell's donations. He spoke of the moral torment he felt upon seeing Sophie's distress. By the time Harrison finished, the tension was so thick that half the observers seemed to be holding their breath. Even James's expensive lawyers struggled to maintain their composure. The fallout of a compromised judge's confession could shatter more than just the immediate custody case. James himself was visibly shaken, though he put on a stoic front. His attorney attempted to shift blame onto Harrison, suggesting it was the judge who had approached Mr. Mitchell for funds or had misconstrued a charitable act, but the evidence Harrison provided was damning. Bank statements, emails referencing expedited transactions, vague but telling messages indicating a quid pro quo. Linda hammered these details home with unflinching clarity. Adding to the turmoil, Carol Harrison appeared in the back of the courtroom. Looking frail but resolute, she approached the witness stand, her movements slow from illness. James's legal team protested that she had no direct involvement, but the judge allowed it, given the gravity of Harrison's testimony. Carol described how she discovered the donation records, how she confronted her husband, and how she refused to let Sophie suffer because of her medical crisis. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she made her plea. No child should pay this price for my health. Sophie deserves a chance at happiness. I stand by my husband's confession, even if it means he loses his position. At that point, the hearing felt like an earthquake. James's mask of composure finally cracked. He lurched to his feet in anger, raising his voice to object. The bailiff admonished him to remain seated. James's lawyers frantically tried to control the damage, but there was little they could do to stem the tide. The diary Sarah had brought, a quiet exhibit waiting in Linda's files, was about to take center stage. Linda carefully approached the bench and requested permission to present Sophie's diary into evidence. The judge granted it, and Linda handed over the small pink book. Page by page, the new judge flipped through the drawings, her face reflecting a deepening horror. The childlike scrawls told a story no spoken words could fully capture. A father looming over his daughter, a paintbrush broken in two, repeated images of a smaller figure trapped in a darkened room. When Linda pointed out the words scribbled on certain pages, "I can't talk. I'm afraid," the judge paused for a long moment. A hush settled over the courtroom, broken only by the soft hum of the overhead lights. In a trembling voice, the judge asked if Sophie could verify she had made these drawings. Sophie, seated with her father, looked tiny in the large wooden pew. She hesitated, eyes darting to James, who glared at her with a silent warning. Linda gently requested permission for Sarah to approach Sophie. The judge considered for a moment, then allowed it. Sarah moved slowly, tears brimming in her eyes, and knelt beside her daughter. "Sophie, sweetheart," she murmured. "No one can hurt you here. Did you draw those pictures?" Sophie's lower lip trembled. She cast one fearful glance at James before shifting her gaze back to her mother. Her voice emerged in a near whisper. "Yes. It was the only way I knew how to tell someone." A weight seemed to lift from the room. Linda quietly led Sophie away from James's side, and the judge permitted it, evidently disturbed by the child's fear. James's lawyers clamored to claim the diary might be fabricated or that Sarah coached Sophie, but the mood in the courtroom had already turned decisively. Too many stories, too much evidence, and now a small child's shaking voice aligned to paint an undeniable picture of control, intimidation, and bribery. As the hearing drew to a close, The judge announced that she would take the evidence under advisement and issue a ruling within 24 hours, given the severity of the allegations. James's team tried to protest, but the judge silenced them with a firm gesture. Sarah felt faint, as though the adrenaline that had sustained her was abruptly draining away. She held Sophie close. For the first time in weeks, her daughter rested her head on her mother's shoulder without looking over her own, no longer terrified of some unseen reprimand. James stormed out of the courtroom, phone pressed to his ear, presumably calling in favors or strategizing a last-minute reprieve. Linda and Harrison exchanged grim looks, aware that James was a cornered animal and could lash out. But for now, the tide had turned in Sarah's favor. Outside, reporters hovered. Word of a high-profile judge confessing to bribery had spread rapidly, and cameras flashed as they emerged. Linda instructed Sarah to remain silent, guiding her and Sophie through a side exit. They parted ways in the parking lot. Sarah, with Sophie's small hand in hers, turned to Harrison. She saw a man bearing the weight of a moral debt he could never fully repay. Still, she offered a quiet thank you, acknowledging that his decision to come clean might have saved her child. He responded with a rueful smile. "I wish I had done the right thing from the start," he said. "Whatever happens to me now, I can finally sleep knowing I helped that little girl." That night, Sarah and Sophie stayed together in Linda's spare room, not yet sure if James would attempt some last-ditch legal maneuver to reclaim his daughter. Sophie remained withdrawn but seemed more at ease in her mother's presence. Before bed, Sarah found Sophie sitting in the living room, cradling a blank sketchbook Linda had given her. For the first time in weeks, the child tentatively picked up a crayon. She drew a shaky outline of two figures, a mother and daughter standing under a sun drawn in bright yellow. Sarah's throat tightened. She knelt beside Sophie. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. Sophie offered a faint smile, the first one Sarah had seen in too long. Together, they added color to the page, weaving red, orange, and gold into a warm, hopeful scene. Although neither spoke much, the act of coloring side by side spoke volumes. The ordeal was far from over, but in that gentle moment, Sarah felt the first stirrings of genuine relief. Whatever storm James might unleash next, they had come too far and risked too much to back down now. In the early morning, just before dawn, Sarah woke to the sound of her phone vibrating on the nightstand. A single text message glowed on the screen, ruling delivered at noon. "Come prepared." It was from Linda. Sarah's heart pounded. The final chapter of this courtroom battle was about to be written, and she prayed with every fiber of her being that justice would prevail. At exactly noon, Sarah and Sophie sat in the front row of the nearly empty courtroom, Linda beside them, while Judge Harrison stood off to one side. His presence now was more symbolic than official. He had recused himself from the case but wanted to bear witness to its resolution. James arrived late, flanked by lawyers and looking uncharacteristically disheveled. Tension coiled like a serpent around the room. The new judge entered. She wasted no time in delivering her decision. Her voice was measured but firm as she reviewed the points. The documented emotional abuse, the credible testimonies, Harrison's confession concerning judicial impropriety, and Sophie's diary. She looked at James with an expression bordering on disgust before turning to Sarah. In light of overwhelming evidence presented, the judge said, "This court deems it in Sophie Mitchell's best interest to be removed immediately from Mr. James Mitchell's custody and placed in the sole custody of her mother, Miss Sarah Cooper." The words hit Sarah like a thunderbolt of relief. She felt Sophie's small hand clutch hers, and tears blurred her vision. Linda exhaled a triumphant breath. For a split second, it felt unreal. After the heartbreak and anguish, after bearing the weight of James's threats and the system's corruption, they had finally prevailed. James erupted in protest, attempting to speak over his lawyers. The judge banged her gavel. "Mr. Mitchell, further outbursts will be held in contempt. You are hereby ordered to comply fully with this custody arrangement, pending the involvement of Child Protective Services to conduct a follow-up investigation." James slumped back, glaring at Sarah with a fury that threatened retribution. But there was little he could do in that moment. The judge wasn't finished. she cast a grave look at Harrison. Your part in this is not forgotten. There will be a formal investigation into your conduct and possible disbarment proceedings. However, your cooperation has helped uncover a broader pattern of influence by wealthy litigants in family court. The relevant authorities have been notified. Harrison bowed his head. He had known this day would come from the moment he stepped forward. He would have to pay a professional and personal price, but at least Sophie would be safe. Carol, seated in the back, closed her eyes as tears slipped down her cheeks. Relief mingled with sorrow. This wasn't the ending they had once hoped for, but it was the best they could do under the circumstances. James stormed out of the room. Reporters and onlookers surged around him, peppering him with questions about alleged corruption. In the swirl of confusion, Sarah pulled Sophie close, feeling the child tremble in her arms. Linda placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder, offering a silent congratulations. They had won a bittersweet victory. Sophie had a chance to heal, but the cost had been high. A swirl of camera flashes and raised voices surrounded them as they made their exit. Harrison stood alone near the judge's bench, ignoring the reporters that now peppered him with shouted inquiries. He watched as Sarah and Sophie walked out together, the little girl clinging to her mother's hand. At the top of the courthouse steps, the cold December wind whipped through Sarah's hair. She guided Sophie through the throng of onlookers. Someone in the crowd yelled out, "Miss Cooper, how do you feel about the verdict?" Another asked, "What happens to Judge Harrison now?" Linda waved them off, shepherding Sarah and Sophie to a waiting car. Once inside, Sophie pressed close to her mother. Sarah planted a gentle kiss on her daughter's forehead, relieved to finally hold her child without the suffocating fear of losing her again. Their battle had reached a resolution, but the aftermath promised new challenges. James was not the kind of man to vanish quietly, and Harrison would soon face the consequences of his confession. Yet, in that moment, mother and daughter were together again, and Sophie had found enough courage to sketch out her inner pain. Sarah silently vowed to help her child rediscover the colors of joy and possibility. No matter what storms might come, they would face them together. High above the Boston skyline, clouds drifted apart, allowing a narrow beam of sunlight to pierce the gray. It seemed almost symbolic, a fragile sign of hope piercing through the shadows of deceit and corruption. Sarah looked at Sophie, who squeezed her hand. They had endured heartbreak, betrayal, and legal warfare. Now they would begin the long journey toward healing, and no bribe or threat would take them from that path again. Sarah drove Sophie home from the courthouse in a hushed car, one trembling hand on the steering wheel, the other clasping her daughter's small fingers. The early afternoon sun broke through the December clouds, illuminating tears of relief on both their faces. After so many weeks of fear and uncertainty, they could finally breathe. The judge's ruling was clear. Sophie was now back under Sarah's custody, free from James's punishing surveillance and rigid demands. Yet the aftermath of the hearing felt almost unreal. A swirl of relief tinged with the knowledge that life would never be quite the same again. When they reached Sarah's modest apartment, Sophie paused at the threshold, staring at the familiar living room with a shy sort of awe. The child had spent enough time in James's sprawling estate to forget the everyday comforts here. The crooked bookshelf filled with art magazines, the small kitchen table where she and Sarah once painted side by side, the frayed sofa that always welcomed them after a long day. Taking a tentative step forward, Sophie set down her backpack and turned to her mother. An unspoken question lay in her eyes, as though she expected James's voice at any moment, forbidding her from even picking up a pencil. "It's all right now," Sarah assured softly, ushering Sophie further inside. "This is home. No one will stop you from being yourself here." Sophie's lips parted in a faint smile, and she raised her arms for a hug. Sarah gathered her close, burying her face in her daughter's hair. They stood there for a long moment, mother and child reunited. Outside, the murmur of traffic carried on as if life were normal, a world unaffected by the storms they had weathered. That evening, Sarah pulled out a fresh set of watercolors she had saved for Sophie's return. She placed them on the table alongside a blank sketchpad, waiting to see if her daughter would approach. Sophie lingered by the sofa, hesitant, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. Eventually, she patted over and ran a gentle hand across the paint tubes. She selected a brush, dipped it into the blue paint, and stroked it across the page. At first, her lines were uncertain, quivering like a newborn fawn learning to stand. But slowly, the strokes gained confidence. Pale blues deepened to bold hues that danced across the paper. Sarah could see the tension draining from Sophie's posture with every brushstroke. "How does it feel?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice soft, not wanting to startle the fragile calm. Sophie glanced up, her eyes bright with tears. "It feels good," she whispered. Her voice, still timid, nonetheless held a note of relief. With those words, the tight coil of worry that had lived in Sarah's chest for weeks began to unspool. They were finally on the path to healing. In the following days, social services made several visits to confirm Sophie's well-being. Sarah cooperated willingly, showing them around the apartment, producing the school records that confirmed Sophie's chronic anxiety. Miss Chun dropped by with encouragement and an offer of free art classes at the community center, whenever Sophie felt ready. Linda Martinez, never one to rest, worked behind the scenes to ensure James's legal avenues were limited. The tension that had pulsed through Sarah's life for so long gradually gave way to a cautious optimism. Yet not all clouds lifted easily. James still owned a powerful business empire, and Sarah had no illusions he would simply fade away. She braced herself for future battles, aware of how single-minded her ex-husband could be when he felt cornered. But for the moment, Sophie slept peacefully each night without fear. That was a victory in itself. Linda did, however, deliver an unexpected piece of news. Child Protective Services have opened an investigation into James's parenting methods. And there are also inquiries into his financial dealings, real estate, hush money paid to local politicians, and so on. His empire isn't as stable as it used to be. Looks like more whistleblowers are coming forward. Sarah nodded, relieved that James might finally face consequences for his underhanded tactics. At the same time, she dreaded what might happen when he realized his business facade was cracking. He had always prided himself on iron control over his reputation. To see that control slip away would be a jarring blow. Meanwhile, Judge Michael Harrison's world unraveled with the inevitability of a toppled domino line. Within a week of his confession, he faced formal disbarment proceedings before the Massachusetts Bar Association. Sarah and Linda attended one of the public hearings, where Harrison stood in front of a tribunal of grim-faced peers. His shoulders were tense, but his voice was resolute as he owned up to his role in the bribery. Carol Harrison sat in the gallery, clutching a white handkerchief, face etched with concern yet radiating support for her husband's belated integrity. In the hush of that assembly room, Harrison recounted how shame had driven him to come forward. Watching Sophie suffer had finally forced him to act. He ended with, "I betrayed the system I once swore to uphold, and I do not ask for leniency. I only ask that the truth be known, so that children like Sophie will never again be pawns in the courtroom." The board members conferred. By the end of the hearing, they announced that Harrison's law license would likely be revoked. He walked out under a sea of reporters' questions, his stride heavier than before. But Sarah couldn't help noticing that there was a quiet dignity about him now. No longer was he skulking under guilt. He was a man determined to atone for his actions, no matter the cost. Time passed. Winter ice melted into spring's fresh buds. Sarah and Sophie's routine found a gentle rhythm. Sarah returned to her teaching job at Franklin Public School, taking on a new initiative to integrate art therapy into the curriculum for children grappling with anxiety or trauma. The principal, moved by Sophie's story, gave Sarah the green light to conduct small workshops after school. Before long, the modest art room blossomed into a safe haven where kids could paint, sculpt, or simply doodle their fears away. Linda, too, turned her energies toward broader reform. Realizing how vulnerable parents like Sarah were to corruption and intimidation, she formed a parent advocacy group alongside others who had endured similar courtroom injustices. Weekly gatherings grew from a handful of attendees to dozens. Mothers, fathers, and grandparents brought their stories, and Linda, unflinching in her legal acumen, guided them on how to expose the hidden manipulations that sometimes rotted the judicial process from within. Ms. Chun volunteered to host art-based healing sessions for children traumatized by custody battles, bridging her love for creative expression with Linda's fight for justice. Meanwhile, rumors circulated that James was under intense financial scrutiny. Former employees spoke of suspect real estate deals and payoffs to city officials. The press seemed eager to investigate, fueling daily news segments that picked apart the once infallible Mitchell name. Reputable clients began distancing themselves, and prospective investors backed away, wary of James's tarnished reputation. Bit by bit, the empire he had fought so hard to preserve began to crumble. Through it all, Sarah never gloated. She felt only a sober sense of relief. James's downfall might be the closest thing to accountability he would ever face. As for Sophie, she blossomed in the slower, gentler pace of life with her mother. She started sleeping through the night without jolting awake from nightmares. She enrolled in Miss Chen's art sessions again, and though the memory of her father's harsh words lingered, she found new courage in painting bright, airy landscapes. Her selective mutism gradually receded. Though still shy in large groups, she dared to speak more freely with close friends. The color returned to her cheeks, and a quiet confidence shone in her eyes. One warm afternoon, Ms. Chun proposed organizing a children's mental health awareness event, showcasing how creative outlets could benefit young people in stressful situations. The event would be held in the Franklin Public School gym, featuring an art exhibition, a short choir performance, and a panel discussion led by Linda Martinez on legal advocacy for vulnerable families. Sarah eagerly threw herself into the planning, recruiting parents and teachers to help. With each passing day, the gym took shape. Easels lined up with children's paintings, bright banners, and scattered brushes and palettes for live demonstration booths. The entire school buzzed with excitement. On the morning of the exhibition, Sarah felt a swell of pride watching Sophie pin up her latest painting, a radiant scene of a sunrise breaking through dark clouds. Every stroke glimmered with fresh hope. Parents and community members began trickling in, pausing to admire the bold colors and the stories behind each child's artwork. Sarah roamed the displays, beaming as she overheard the children explaining the emotions behind their paintings. Every mention of art therapy helped me feel better or colors make me braver felt like a personal victory. Midway through the event, Sarah's breath caught in her throat when she noticed Judge Harrison standing near the entrance. He wore civilian clothes, looking unsure, hands clasped behind his back. A year ago, such a sight would have made her tense with resentment. But their paths had changed, and so had both of them. She approached Sophie by her side. The judge offered a hesitant smile. "I heard about this event," Harrison said quietly. "I wanted to see how the children are using art to heal. My wife is feeling better these days, thank God. She sends her regards." Sophie studied him for a moment, then reached into the small art portfolio she carried. She pulled out a folded piece of paper and handed it to him. The painting was titled, "The Truth Sets Us Free." Against a background of swirling blues and yellows, two figures, one taller, one smaller, stood near a bright window. A beam of sunlight fell upon them, separating them from a looming shadow at the painting's edge. The color palette felt both gentle and triumphant, as if capturing the precise moment light conquers darkness. Harrison's eyes misted as he recognized the symbolism. A child stepping out of the shadow of fear, guided by someone's decision to tell the truth. He met Sophie's gaze, and though she still spoke softly, her voice was steady. "Thank you," she said, "for helping me go home." The judge blinked away tears and cleared his throat. "I don't deserve thanks," he murmured. "But I won't forget this painting or you." Sarah stood by, her own eyes brimming. In that small exchange, it felt as though a painful circle was closing. Whatever mistakes Harrison had made, he had chosen to rectify them at enormous personal cost. Now, standing in the midst of bright paintings and hopeful children, the heartbreak of that old courtroom seemed both distant and undeniably necessary, a catalyst that had sparked change. Later, Linda took the stage for a short speech. She commended the school's adoption of Sarah's art therapy curriculum and announced the formation of a new family court oversight committee. The audience applauded when Linda revealed that both Sarah and Ms. Chun had been asked to serve as founding members, ensuring children's voices would carry weight in future custody cases. It was a moment that underscored how far they had all come. From standing helplessly in a rigged system to actively shaping a more transparent and compassionate one. Throughout the afternoon, the exhibition attracted a steady stream of visitors. Friends, educators, child psychologists, even local reporters came to witness how art therapy could restore a child's capacity to speak their truth. Off to the side, Harriet, the former nanny fired by James, stood admiring Sophie's paintings with a smile that spoke of relief and validation. Ms. Chun scurried about, encouraging timid children to dip their brushes into vibrant colors. The room hummed with a spirit of renewal. By the time the last visitor left, the sun had begun its slow descent, painting the sky outside in soft oranges and purples. Sarah and Sophie were among the last to remain, helping to clean brushes and store easels. Finally, the two of them stepped outside onto the school's front steps, the warm air embracing them. Sarah sat down, pulling Sophie onto her lap. "How do you feel?" Sarah asked, lightly brushing a stray curl from her daughter's forehead. "Tired," Sophie admitted with a shy grin, "but good. Really good." They stayed there for a few minutes, watching the deepening colors of dusk. A silent understanding passed between them. This was the life they had fought for, one where fear no longer dictated their days. Sophie had her mother's gentle reassurance, and Sarah had her daughter's bright spirit. Together, they could face whatever came next. Before heading home, they spotted Judge Harrison standing under a lamppost near the school exit, quietly observing the last of the volunteers depart. Carol was with him, leaning on his arm. Even from a distance, Sarah could sense a relief radiating from them both, as though they too had discovered a measure of peace in this final chapter. A faint smile curved Carol's lips, suggesting that her remission was at least stable for now. A small grace after all the turmoil. Sophie waved at them. Carol waved back, and Harrison gave a nod, a gesture of respect and perhaps self-forgiveness. Then they turned and walked away, disappearing into the gentle twilight. Sarah squeezed Sophie's hand, taking in the moment. The Mitchell Empire might still linger, and challenges could arise again. But for now, there was solace in seeing how many lives had been touched and changed by Sophie's story. Betrayal had led to truth, fear to courage, and heartbreak to a renewed faith in love's power to protect and heal. "Come on," Sarah whispered, standing up. "Let's go home, kiddo." Sophie nodded, clinging to her mother's hand as they headed to the car. Behind them, the school's lights blinked off, painting the windows in darkness. But the real glow remained in the small girl skipping by Sarah's side, her laughter drifting through the balmy evening air like a promise. They drove away, hearts light with the knowledge that a new season of their lives had begun, one colored by hope, integrity, and the artistry of second chances.